I'm a retired skydiving instructor. I'm a Fanshawe College student. I'm a peer support worker for human trafficking victims. I've received a Queen's Diamond Jubilee for my efforts working anti-human trafficking. And it's ironic that I came to Canada to become human trafficked because when I was in South Africa, I fought the system and was against apartheid and fought slavery there. Well, I had lost my mother, my husband, and my two best friends within a period of 6 months. And I was, in hindsight, struggling with undiagnosed clinical depression and something called complicated grief. And that's what made me vulnerable. Traffickers are very good at spotting vulnerable people. And I met my girlfriend's husband's best friend, and they introduced me to him, and initially he came with excellent references, and that's how it started for me. Well, my boyfriend, which is a very typical scenario that we see in Canada, which is called the Loverboy Romeo / pimp scenario. And what happened to me was that he romanced me, and for me it was winter when I met him, and he would always clear the snow off my car. I never got into a cold car. I would come home and there'd be gifts everywhere. He showered me with gifts, and this is a typical scenario. And because I was such a mess emotionally, it got to the point where within 6 months he asked me to move in with him, and I said yes. And he said he would take care of everything, not to worry, he would help me carry the load I was carrying. But unbeknownst to me, I let him handle all the finances because I was such a puddle. I was a mess emotionally. One day the sheriff turned up at the door and said we were being evicted. Now, I didn't know this, but he wasn't paying any of the bills or anything. And it was at this point that he said to me, it's my turn to take care of the family. And that's what they're calling it now, a family. And they're not even calling themselves pimps anymore. They're calling themselves managers. And by now I had been isolated from all my family and friends. And this is a tactic you see all the time. My identification had been held in safekeeping. And he had decided that I would work in the bars. So the appropriate attire was bought, and I went to work in the bar. Now, at the age of 14, I was sexually assaulted. At the age of 18, I was sexually assaulted. And at the age of 16, I was sexually assaulted. So I had learned very early on, that my body was not mine for the taking. So I wasn't as shocked as I should have been when he suggested it. I was trafficked for 8 years. I cried every single day for 8 years. Now, I don't know if most people know this, but when you walk into a strip bar, you don't get paid for being there. You actually have to pay them for the privilege of being on the floor. So you pay to work. You have to do a minimum of 3 stage shows and a minimum of 4 hours on the floor. The first song when you're on stage, you're fully clothed. The second song, you have to take a top or a bottom off. The third song, you're naked. And all the while you're up there, you've got guys out in the crowd yelling, my granny's got nicer boobs than you, and insulting you. And the whole time you have to smile while you're naked under those conditions because you hope that some guy in the audience likes enough of what he sees of you to take you into the back where the sofas are and what I call sexually assault you. Now you dance per song in the back. A song lasts on average 3 to 5 minutes, and you charge $20 a song, and that's before extras. And anybody who tells you that extras are not happening in strip bars has never been to one or is lying. And so now what happens is the traffickers, the pimps, the managers sit on the floor and they count how many songs you're back there, so you can't hide the money. You come out from the back, and I'm telling you, these guys are radical. The stuff, anything you can imagine, everything you can imagine is happening in these bars. So you come back off the floor and you hand your money over, and that's what a typical day looks like. I eventually became so desperate. I got evicted from my place because he wasn't paying the bills. The sheriff came to lock the doors. That's when I was told I would be dancing. I then got another place, and the same thing happened. But this time, I lost all my furniture and I had to go live out of a motel. Now, there's some really seedy motels here, and there were many nights when I was chased through the parking lot by strange men and ran behind my door and sat and would shake to the degree that when he walked in, even though he wasn't good, I was happy to see him. And I would wake up in the morning and see footprints on my door where the guys had tried to kick the door in to get to me. But then I managed to run to a shelter. But when I got there, they told me they had no room for me, so I had to go back to him. A few days later, I phoned the shelter and I got back again. But he found me there that same day and proceeded to throw what was left of my belongings at the building. Once they had threatened him with law enforcement, he left. But then they told me I could no longer stay there as my presence there endangered all the other women. They then moved me to another shelter. I then was admitted to hospital because I became ill. Now, if you're away from the shelter for more than 2 nights, you're evicted. So I was discharged from the hospital with the clothes on my back and a quarter and nowhere to go. And there was only one person in the world I knew who would come and get me, and that was him. So I've seen women in the shelter that had been on life support, go back to traffickers because they had nowhere to go. But now he decides that I'm not allowed to live in a motel. I have to live out of the car. So now I would get lucky some days and he would park in a park next to a porta-poo, so at least I had a bathroom. But where do you wash? Where do you shave? I would shave in sinks, have my leg up on the sink and shave there, working. Eventually I ran again. Now it took me 2 years to escape. Eventually I ran again to the Salvation Army, but he found me there again. Now these men are making roughly $200,000 and $350,000 a year per girl. And they usually have what's called a stable, so they'll have 5, 6, 7 girls times $250,000. Now, I thought he was coming after me because he loved me. You must remember, I still thought I was in love. But it wasn't that, it was the money. So he found me at Salvation Army again and chased me up the stairs. Now, luckily for me, an alert security guard picked up on the situation and got me behind a locked door. He then went to the social worker on the floor and she found the women's shelter who agreed to take me back. Now, I got into the shelter, but to get on the priority / urgent care housing list in London, Ontario, you need a letter from your landlord stating that you were living with your abuser. How do you get that letter if your landlord was your abuser? So, like I said, I've seen women going back to their abusers because they couldn't get that letter. So I decided to go to some of the motels that I'd been staying in and ask for that letter. All of them except for one said no, and the one that didn't blackmailed me and said if I didn't give them money, they were going to tell my trafficker. So I gave them money, and luckily, he actually did give me a letter. So I got into housing, and that's how I was able to escape. Well, when I was in it, and for a while afterwards, I used to think, why me, why me, why me? But through education, I learned how it happened to me. And through great self-introspection, I learned why. And it's so that I can do the work I do now. I work with women who are being trafficked. I've managed to get several out. Unfortunately, one of the women I was working with hung herself before I could help her. But I'm dedicating my life to this, trying to eradicate this travesty. And I've opened a drop-in for women who are trafficked and actually still working on the streets. And the goal is to provide exit strategies when they're ready. So we form collaboration, and this is in London. There are at least 250 recognized trafficking victims, and that's women who self-identify it. Because most women who are being trafficked most trafficking victims don't self-identify as being trafficked. For me, that word wasn't in my vocabulary. I didn't know what it meant. And you'll find that with a lot of the women, So we know of at least 250 women in London that have self-identified as being trafficked, and the goal is to help these women. All of a sudden, new changes in their behavior, like designer clothing, their nails being done, hair being done, inappropriate sexual talk, secretiveness, and often you'll find that these women don't look people in the eye. They're always looking down at the ground because they've been taught to. Malnourishment, not having any money even though they seem to be working, not in control of their daily lives. And we often notice that a woman, or I'm talking about women because that's who I'm dealing with and that's what we're seeing primarily here in London, is everybody knows where Shoppers Drug Mart is. Everybody knows where Tim Hortons is. But if you ask a woman where it is and she doesn't know where it is, there's a sign she's being trafficked because she doesn't know where she is. It's a complex question, but I think the primary thing that needs to be done is addressing the demand. The men who are buying sex, because if there is no demand, there's no need for supply. I speak at the John School, which is a court-mandated diversion program for men who are arrested communicating for the purpose, first offense. And what I try and do is humanize the woman to the men. I say things like, would you take your mother, aunt, daughter, niece, or sister to a dark alley at 3 a.m, drop her off, and drive away with another thought to her? And to a man, they'll go, no. And I go, why'd you do it to her? Does she not matter? We need to address the buyers. There are bigger issues than just that, like poverty, because it gives no... If you have no choice but to sell your body, then it was never a choice to sell it. So poverty is a big issue. It's weird. They went from one end of the spectrum to the other. Like, I had one guy who was... In our society, in a coming of age, it's a rite of passage for a guy, as soon as they turn of drinking age, to go to the strip bar. So if you get a dance for them, sometimes they're so nervous they're shaking. Other times, they see you as the whore, and they will... I can't really say this on camera. The stuff that they will do to you will leave bruises and marks for days. Cuts. They will try and... everything you can imagine. And then you get the husbands who will sit there and tell you how much they love their wives and their children, and they'll show you photographs of their families, and then they'll say the most disgusting things to you. And they'll say it's because they can't ask their wife to do it because their wife's mouth kisses their children, but yours doesn't. Everything you can imagine, everything. I was working with a woman who was in a strip bar and was completely out of her depth. And I was able to contact her and form a relationship to the point where she trusted me, and we were able to talk. And we discussed exit strategies, which she implemented. And she's now a receptionist in an office and very happy. I was 35 when I trafficked, and this is really important because I had traveled the world extensively. I was a skydiving instructor. I was not young and naive, so if it could happen to me, imagine how easily it can happen to a 12 or 13 or 14-year-old. I was trafficked for 8 years, and like I said, I was so desperate I started to burn myself with cigarettes, adding to the other cigarette burns that customers had given me. Please know when I use the word customer, I'm being incredibly diplomatic. These men have no regard for the women. They have none whatsoever. They're objects, they're pieces of meat. Getting out is hard because, like I said earlier, women don't identify as being trafficked. That word was never in my vocabulary. I didn't know what it meant. So getting out is very hard for the women. They need supports, they need people to believe in them. They need hope, they need options, they need services. And we really need a safe house here in London, because if you take a trafficked woman and you put her in an abused woman's shelter, often the other women who are being abused, their abusers had issues around pornography and prostitution. So when she walks in, she's seen as the enemy and can be re-victimized in the shelter. So we need safe houses dedicated to human trafficking victims and the unique and complex issues that they struggle with, because there's PTSD, there's disassociation, there's drug addiction, and self-esteem issues all at the same time. If I could get one message out, I want the public to know that it's happening. It's happening here in London. It's real. And when you see a woman on the street, think that some story got her there, that she may be in trouble, and not to judge at all.